It's interesting, looking through the sketchbooks, I think ideas drove Donald. He seemed to be searching for a language in which to be able to say that. He couldn't necessarily say that he was a painter or a sculptor because he would use whatever media would enable him to talk about what he wanted to talk about. Donald grew up in Birmingham, in Smethwick. He was the youngest of 12. His parents were coming from Jamaica to, make the new life. His father worked in a factory and his mum worked as a nurse, a healthcare worker. I first met Donald when I was at Trent Polytechnic in Nottingham.
He arrived at Trent, as I say, he was part of this intake of about 5 black students at that time. And he was just incredibly flamboyant. I saw him from a distance, he was wearing some kind of huge brimmed hat and stuff. Also, he had this real sense of what he wanted to do as an artist.
I mean, he was very funny, very, very funny, so very humorous. There was also an element about him which, actually this is through his work, was sort of very bittersweet. I don't think that was in his personality. He was very generous.
He was making some really interesting work at that time. I remember that he was making these encaustic flowers.
He always mythologized about how he was a very good flower painter, and it was when he met Keith Piper and Eddie Chambers that he said that he became radicalized and realized he knew what he wanted to say. So he made the jump from making flower paintings into making work about himself, making work about the black experience, making work about black masculinities.
The Black Art Group was in effect an association or a small grouping of young artists, young art students, all interestingly of Caribbean descent, all interestingly based in universities or polytechnics then, which were outside of London. It was a group which was very clearly marked by its particular position in terms of the way in which we saw, the way in which we hoped that art practice could work as a component part of a broader political struggle. And Donald would have joined that group or become involved sometime during 1981.
Everybody at college was aware of Donald's sickle cell. He'd been at college and then he had to leave college to have both hips replaced.
One of the effects of sickle cell is that it attacks the bones, and so he had to have some hip replacements, the first of many, unfortunately. And so that, affected first his ability to get around, also the fact that he then would spend a long time in bed.
I'm thinking that Donald always said that when he was a child, because of his sickle cell anemia, he was often in hospital throughout his childhood. In fact, he went to a school where there was a unit for the physically disabled, and he was in that unit. So I think things about disability, about being the other, being different, was always very much part of things that he wanted to talk about. Donald would always carry a sketchbook. When he was going into hospital, and sometimes if we'd called an ambulance at 3-4 in the morning, he would make sure that he had his sketchbooks with him. And he would work on the sketchbooks throughout his hospital stays.
And so what we have is this incredible collection of 48 sketchbooks, all which can be kind of placed chronologically. And so you can see this unfolding practice through these sketchbooks.
He would draw often what he could see in front of him. So there are drip stands and blood bags and nurses, hospital objects from there. So in many ways he was documenting to an extent his experience within that hospital. But I think he was always thinking beyond that. So stories about race, black masculinities, he would take that and incorporate that into his work.
So in a sense, it becomes this kind of really fascinating map of an individual's response to a set of political moments.
There's devices that he used, like the X-rays, to talk about things that were under the surface. Donald had several hip replacement operations. And during one of these operations, he had an abscess on his thigh. So when the leg went down, he found that he could peel off a whole section of his skin from his thigh, which he did. He peeled a whole section off. And then he kept it. He folded it and kept it in his, I think, Filofax or something he had then.
And this was at a moment when, in terms of his relationship with his own father, because his father had died 2 years earlier, and part of that thing of coming to terms with that, also coming to terms with the fact that he hadn't been able to go to his father's funeral. So in a sense, there was this whole thing around the home, relationship with his father, this kind of strange thing around fragility, the fragility of black space, also the fragility of his own body.
He said, I know what I want to make. And he got some dressmaker pins, and I think some Scotch tape, and then fashioned this beautiful small house. And if you look in his sketchbooks, I think for the last 10 years over his sketchbooks, the image of the house is a constant theme. And so he made this house out of his own skin and placed it on his hand. I think Donald was always aware that he only had a certain amount of time. He made work in spite of his illness. I think it was also a driver. He wanted to sometimes say, I want to say things before I leave this mortal coil. I have this to say, and he would find ways of saying it. When Donald died, there were a lot of people who were very supportive and aware that there was work of Donald's and what was going to happen to it. I think I knew that the sketchbooks were under my bed. They couldn't stay under my bed for years and years, and actually I used to worry about them being there if anything had happened to them, and such care and consideration had been taken when Donald was alive. I mean, it was when he had a sickle cell crisis and he was unwell, it was the first thing he would ask for, where are my sketchbooks, where are they, or take care of them. So they were incredibly important to him. I think there was something about Donald wanting to share his ideas, his thoughts as well, because actually in the hospital he was very open with his sketchbooks, and what was contained in those books he just knew was so important for further research. Donald critiqued history, art history, but he also demanded his place in it. And so having those sketchbooks in Tate, having them online, is Donald demanding his place in art history.